I think you need to get a few things into context. You talked about blanket bogs there, Ms. Wilson, and about all that can be done. Get one thing clear into your head: it's private property. Have you a right to go onto someone's private property? Second of all, in the relation to the SACs, and in fairness to Brian Lucas and the National Parks, they're drawing up a management plan on reweighting. And reweighting, yeah, when people heard about reweighting, they thought that the water would be running down. It's not. They have consulted in different areas, in fairness with the National Parks, and I had a many row with them, but in fairness to them, they have consulted with people in areas, and if there's any problems, they have addressed those problems. But let's get clear. What was the 53 raised bogs? They were brought in under the Habitats Directive. What were they brought in for? And contradict me if I'm wrong on this. They were brought in to save an amount of bog because the rest of Europe had cut theirs. That's what it was brought in for. It wasn't brought in about climate, or it wasn't brought in about saving tons of Anthem. There's no part of climate written into it. Am I correct in that?
You're correct.
Yeah. So we're gone on to another world now about the 53 SACs, about how we're going to save Ireland with them. But that's what the Habitats Directive was about. And let's be clear on that. Second of all, it is not helpful when the likes of the national parks are trying to resolve issues on the 53 bogs. You have called them the best bogs in the country, right? And one question I want you to address is when you have a bog that's basically functioning in that you've re-wetted and you have active raised bogs starting to work back again, what's the carbon sequestration per acre on that bog? How many tonnage per year per acre? I've been at a conference, but I would like to know on a raised bog, because I know that the blanket bog is totally different. Isn't that correct? Blanket bog regenerates away quicker than the raised bog. The other thing you made a point about, Ms. Wilson, is you said that if the cut on the outside of the bog, they destroy the middle of the bog. Well, I have been with Ray Flynn, who I'm sure you know well, from Queen's, and I have been with RPS, and I've been on complexes of 3,000 acres, right? And they can prove that maybe for 200 metres or 250 metres, yes, you would have an effect, but inside that, the bog will stay intact, because you have to be able to show under the Habitats Directive that you do not have an adverse effect. That's the wording of the Habitats Directive, that you don't have an adverse effect. So I think you said earlier that the middle of the bog would get degraded is not correct. Thirdly, in relation to the debacle that's gone on about de-designating bogs, there was Category 1 and Category 2 bogs. There was degraded bogs, there was bogs that weren't worthwhile regenerating. And when the scientists went out and done it, the likes of RPS, but people don't want to look into this, it was absolutely useless to go back trying to put those bogs back. So what they done, they went around the country and they looked for other bogs that would help them in the overall plan of getting to the targets that was required. Isn't that right? And they got that to make the new plan, which was a sensible thing to do, rather than like Raheen Moor. Are you familiar with Raheen Moor bog? Where in 1979, and I think you should all listen to this, was taken over, given to the national parks by Bord na Móna. There was liners put into it that blew out of the way. The bog was trying to be restored, but to this day, it is basically a bog that is nearly impossible to get regenerating or refunctioning. Compared with bogs where I am in the west of Ireland, where people cut domestic turf and the base of the bog is still there, will always be there, and it's like biting at the toes of an elephant, and those bogs are able to regenerate and you can re-wet them and work with them an awful lot better. But I think in fairness to the national parks, I've listened earlier on where they were getting stick that why wouldn't this 28 million tonnes or 11 billion or whatever was in it, that in fairness, the first thing you have to do with anyone, I cannot go into your house and say I'm taking it over. No more than can I go into your private property in a bog. And the national parks cannot do that. And on top of that, they have re-wetted some bogs at the moment, and they will have difficulty for the simple reason there are private landowners that they wouldn't be familiar with, for the simple reason there is turbary rights, there is fee simple rights, there is 8 different rights in bogs. And those people will shove their head above the parapet very shortly, and they can ask for their drains to be reopened where re-wetting was done because you went in on private property. Now, either we're going to be communists in this country that we're going to take over the world, or we're going to talk to people, sit down with them and work with them in a proper fashion. But I do want those questions about the sequestration of what you call those charm bogs in the line of the 53, the tonnage of sequestration. And to Mr. Lucas, would it be fair to say, and look, you have people dealing with this in the last few years, in the regeneration of bogs, we'll call it, and you have to put a machine in on it with low ground pressure. And the 5 million, and I have in my estimate, and I've talked to some of your people, would it be fair to say, and we've seen the Bord na Móna side of it, which would be more intensive of trying to regenerate a bog, because the bogs that you are working in at the moment has the vegetation, has very little drainage on it compared with it, because the drainage on it would have been done the time of the council. Domestic turf cutters don't need drainage on a bog to cut it, let's be clear on that. But in the line of Bord na Móna bogs, and you talk about a 5 million packet that's there, it is the general estimation is about 17 diggers for 240 days, which is 17 people for 240 days. Is that a fair assessment on what you have done so far, Brian, in around the country? And I know that you're going to some bogs at the moment, Carabehi and that, but that's what the work that 5 million does on bogs that are fairly well intact. If you look at Bord na Móna bogs, that there is a lot more, we'll say, as was pointed out earlier, drains every 12 metres, it will be more intense for the machines. Would you think that there'll be less work you'll get done then because of that?
Thank you. And we're short. I know there's a lot of questions there, but we are, if you can try and keep it as succinct as possible. Thank you.
Maybe I'll start. So, as I said earlier, for the 5 million that is earmarked for budget 2020, overall that programme involves 36 bogs, which would be the designated sites, the designated raised bog sites, so that's what I'll focus on. So beginning with 9 bogs next year. So over the whole programme, what you're hoping then to store is 28 megatons of carbon. For the ones for next year, you would hope to store 6 megatons of carbon, which that would result in reduction in CO2 emissions of around 5,000 tonnes per year. Now, I did look at the figures for, like I've seen myself, I've been on bogs that I've seen the drains have been blocked and have been successfully blocked, and that's done, as Deputy Fitzmaurice has said, with a digger, and you insert the peat dams or the plastic dams. I just can't. I could send on the figures that we have. We have done some estimates how many machines you'd need over a bog and all that. I just off the top of my head, I can't remember the figures.
My understanding that it's 19 machines for 240 days is what 5 million of work will do.
Yeah, probably best I'd send it on rather than me trying to record.
Bord na Móna, I'd want to get a lot of machines.
We can get that in writing and send it to the Deputy and to the members.
Sure, no problem.
Dr Renou-Wilson.
Yes. I want to clarify, peatlands have 2 functions when it comes to carbon. It stores the carbon that is already in there, okay? And that's the biggest issue at the moment, is this carbon that has taken thousands of years to basically accumulated in the peat. Peat roughly is 50 kilograms of carbon per cubic meter of peat. That's why it's important. It's there. It's a concentration of carbon. Now, to re-wet it is just to keep that carbon in, okay? It's to stop emitting, and that is really critical for Ireland to stop, to basically when they will have to pay for this carbon. Now, when you restore it in this program, the restoration and only restored sites will be able to sequester more carbon, and the figures are in the strategy. I can't find it right now, but
That's what I'm asking.
I think it's roughly 7. I'll have to check that again.
Because I was at a conference in Dublin Castle that a guy said he was from Holland or somewhere that it was 40 tonnes.
Well, it depends. Like that's the problem. Is that are you talking about an annual figure, or are you talking over 100?
Annual.
Yeah, no, but I mean an average. Are you talking about an average?
An average annual figure.
Okay. The thing is, you have to remember is you have peat for a reason. You have peat because it has sequestered carbon. So if you want the proof is in the pudding. You have a bog, and that bog is there because carbon has been sequestered.
I am asking, I know that forestry can do 10 tonnes to the acre. right?
Yeah, but
So
that's
are
not
you telling me
forever.
the peat is less?
That's just that's just once and for all. Forestry is a once-off carbon sink. Carbon is an annual, constant carbon sink, and that's what's important with the peat. And unlike forestry, it has already a huge amount of carbon already there, which once drained, it's released to the atmosphere. So that's why the rewetting is important. And your second question was about the blanket bogs. Not all, and I appreciate the private properties, I agree, but my recommendation is to first start with publicly owned blanket bogs. And believe me, there is publicly owned blanket bogs. Quilter owns a lot of blanket bogs. So we'll have to start with those, I agree, and show how it's done. And then we move on to help the farmers that want to re-wet their land and in a way that is feasible to support them and farm carbon. The way it's done in Wales, in Scotland, farmers now are being paid to re-wet their vast area of blanket bogs, and farmers are really happy to do that.
What about the middle of the bog? You said a bit drained when I asked you.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I think you were on a site there where again it's a confusion about why did this study was done. The scientists were on the ground to understand whether cutting in a particular place, okay, which we call the handle of the pan, because it's where the bog is here and the handle is there, and cutting there is not impacting there. And that has been shown, and I agree with this.
So not every bog, it needs to be clarified to people.
I totally agree, and I said that, I think, clearly. Not every bog is rewettable and will damage the raised bog.
Am I correct in saying, because going by those scientists as well that I would have met, that where ordinary domestic turf cutting has taken place and what we call the cutaway bog,
yes,
right, that the regeneration of that has been way faster than actually the high bog?
I agree. I agree, and this is a really good, actually, example where we should support the regeneration of those cutaway areas where we have. You know why? Because it's lower in the elevation, so you can re-wet that first and foremost. That's the first thing we need to do to help the rest of the bog.
But the regeneration of it and turf cutting taking place, domestic turf cutting. I'm not talking about peat. Peat is above in the air. But I'm talking about domestic turf cutting. The regeneration around that, where it has been tested, has been phenomenal, going by those scientists.
If you stop cutting?
No, they were still cutting in at the face bank, but out in the fossil.
Okay, well, every site is as different. You know, again, if it's protected, no, you're still cutting turf is not going to help, of course, if it's protected. In a site that is not protected, the farmer, a typical blanket bog, I envisage a typical blanket bog, and I'm not talking about protection, typical blanket bog could still have ongoing turf cutting in areas without damaging the main part of the blanket bog. But it has to be clear where and to stop there and not go on further into the blanket bog, which should be wet then, because you can't have re-wetting and cutting.
I think that one thing needs to be made clear and coming out from a committee, that it is not helpful that the national parks are trying to resolve an issue, and there are people working with them, and so is the ecologists and the scientists, and they are trying to find alternatives for people to make sure that those 53 are as far as possible preserved, and that we can, get re-wetting done. And also we have to watch that minerals from land doesn't come in, that we have to make sure that the drain between the bog and the land is kept clear, because minerals from land isn't good for the bog. So, but there's objections coming in, and any environmentalist that's out there today looking, for God's sake, if you keep objecting, what you're going to do is, it's private property and people will keep doing what they were doing until there's an alternative put in front.
Thank you, Dr.